Today we start the book of Ruth, and we said that we did this because we just finished the book of Judges, and of course the very first verse in the book of Ruth, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. So we decided to go ahead and do this. We studied that actually on Wednesday evening. I led the study from May to July of 2021 in our Wednesday night auditorium class. So it's for those of you who come on Wednesday night, it might still be fairly fresh for you. We're not going to spend a lot of time on Ruth. We're not going to dig into all the details about it, but just kind of remind ourselves about this particular book because it's such a contrast to what we've been studying about in the book of Judges. And as we said the last time, if Judges left a bad taste in your mouth, then Ruth is the breath mint to make it better. Because it just, the book of Judges started off bad and it didn't get any better and just ended on a terrible note. And so the story of Ruth shows us that even though there's extensive evil, whether it's in Israel or in the world, there is good there somewhere. Always we can find the good, and that's what we need to be. That's what we need to be looking for. New Open Bible Study Edition says of Ruth, and this is my study Bible I use that I keep on my desk and my computer open in front of me every day. Ruth is a cameo story of love, devotion, and redemption, set in the black context of the days of the Judges. It is the story of a Moabite woman who forsakes her pagan heritage in order to cling to the people of Israel and to the God of Israel. Because of her faithfulness in a time of national faithlessness, God rewards her by giving her a new husband, Boaz, a son, Obed, and a privileged position in the lineage of David and Christ. She is the great-grandmother of David. And so again, this story is good news to a certain extent. It starts off with a little bit of bad news, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Robert A. Watson in the Expositor's Bible says, leaving the book of Judges and opening the story of Ruth, we pass from vehement outdoor life, from tempest and trouble, into a quiet domestic scene. After an exhibition of the greater movement of a people, we are brought, as it were, to a cottage interior in the soft light of an autumn evening, to obscure lives passing through the cycle of loss and comfort, affection and sorrow. And you'll know how that plays out if you've read the book. Illustrated Dictionary of the Bible, Herbert Lockyer, edits that this was a period when the nation lapsed again and again into worship of false gods. What a contrast this is to Ruth. To remain faithful to God, although she was a Moabite by birth, one considered an alien by God's chosen people. And that's what I think makes the story even more amazing, is where she came from and her background and her history. She wasn't an Israelite, she was a Moabite. And historically there have been tensions between those two groups of people, and so that makes this story all the more interesting to think about. Maybe what she had to overcome in her own mindset to embrace this new faith and new religion. Alfred Edersheim, it comes upon us with such sweet contrast, almost like a summer's morning after a night of wild tempest. Again, these are just some of the statements that commentators have made, and there's a lot more of them than we could look at because they all say a lot about that. Ruth is read at the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. It's a Jewish tradition there, and so they still do that today. It's part of their ritual there. Again, that comes from the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible. John T. Willis, who was one of our brothers in the Message of the Old Testament, said, God works in his world to accomplish that which is best for his people. And of course, that's what he did by allowing Moab to be a part of this narrative and Ruth to be a part of this narrative. That which distinguishes the true God from false gods is that he is alive and works in nature and history continually to accomplish his purpose. Because who would have ever thought a Moabitess lady would become the great-grandmother of King David and be in the lineage of Jesus all the way down there. And I always find it amazing, and this is just me supposing because there's no way to answer this, but what did God have to do to arrange the world in order for Ruth to be there when she was, where she was, how she was, in order to play into this role? Rahab. What did God have to do to put her in that place so that she was able to do what she did? And for God, we know that it's nothing. He can do anything He wants to, but at the same time, there's much more going on in this world than what we can see. And those outcomes that we see, He may have planned long before the foundation of the world. And we just we're not told how that all works, but I think that's an interesting point that he makes. It talks about the importance of mutual love in the home. And of course, I have used this statistic before in a lesson that the Colorado Springs Police Department answers on the average 40 domestic violence calls a day. That's every day. And talk to any officer, those are the most dangerous calls they go out on, because emotions are high. All of a sudden, the husband's going to get carted off to jail because he's beat his wife, and she changes her mind, and things can get ugly. And so here's a setting where family works like it's supposed to, and where there's love in the home. And that's something that modeled for us that we can understand and appreciate. The importance of converting pagans to the worship of the one true God and the fellowship with His people. We don't think about that much, but there were proselytes in the Jewish nation who came from other nations, and that was welcomed by God and wanted by God. In fact, he started off when he put the Egyptians down. You remember he told Pharaoh, so that they and the world will know that I'm God. That's why I'm doing this. And so that draw was there. How faithful Israel was in pursuing that, that's the question that we can't really answer. Because the Israelite people seemed to come to the point where they were so proud of who they were. We are the bloodline of Abraham. We are God's chosen people. That they seemed to get to the point where they weren't welcoming of other people in. That they didn't want other people in. Whereas that was kind of what God wanted for them. And again, we can't speak too much to that because Scripture doesn't talk about it that much. But if that was what God wanted, and we see these instances of Rahab and Ruth being brought in and being a blessing to the family, why didn't that happen more? And maybe it was because Israel got to the point of they were satisfied with their little kingdom. And if you bring somebody new into that little kingdom, what happens? It changes it, doesn't it? Or it can change it. Now, lesson for the church. We're to be evangelistic, correct? Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. But isn't it nice, our little group here? I mean, we know everybody. I look around here and I don't see a strange face in this whole room. And yet, when somebody new comes in, what's the potential for that?
No matter what, it changes the dynamic.
It changes the dynamic, doesn't it? Somebody new. But that's what God wants us to do. To embrace that new. To embrace those people who need Jesus. And so what if it changes our dynamic? We adapt and move on. Because every one of you and me were not members of the church at one point in time. And so we came in. For me, as I've told you, I was raised in the church, as we say, and so it was not much of a transition for me because I was already there. But for those of you who maybe came out of a denomination or another religious group, you came into a church and I'll just use the word, you disrupted what they had because you were new and you were different. Not in a bad way, necessarily, but it was something different. And there had to be those bonds formed and that acceptance and that welcoming in there for you to still be around. Because I think if you had not been accepted, you probably wouldn't have stuck with it in doing what you were doing. John?
Just by nature, things reach equilibrium over a certain
Sure.
amount of time, and for us to keep growing. There's things we get used to. We figure out how to settle in with each other, and we get comfortable and complacent.
Yeah.
That's not how you don't keep an edge sharp by doing that. You got to put a stone to it to keep it.
Exactly. And we see a new person come in, and we don't know what they are, and yet I'm looking around this room now at faces that weren't here when I first moved here in 2004. And there's a bunch of you out there. But you know what I found and what I think? That you've been a blessing to this congregation. You've been a blessing to me. You've been a blessing to the rest of us. And I think it's proven that that process can work. And the day we quit doing that is the day we start quitting being the people that God wanted us to be. So I think this is interesting about the book of Ruth in that it steps outside of the typical, Judges was all about what was going on in Israel. And this steps out of that and looks at the world in a little bit larger context. Now, granted, standing on the western shore of the Dead Sea, you can see Moab right there. So it's not like we'll show a map in a minute, it's not like they went very far. But it was right there and in distance. So it wasn't that far, except having to go north around the sea or south around the sea. Dave and Grady and Wayne and Bob got to see it from the other side. Y'all went that far south, didn't you? Yeah, and they got to see from the Moab side and back into Israel while they were in Jordan. And so it's not far off in geography, but it was worlds away in the society that was going on there. Root is, I think, how it's pronounced in Hebrew, and that's what it looks like. And I took the time to put that up there, and it's probably the last time I'll ever use that because I don't speak Hebrew, but that's it. Reut means comrade or companion, which is a kindred word to that. So that's what her name was. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor. And that word neighbor is reut, that Hebrew word, articles of silver and articles of gold, all the way back in Exodus chapter 11 and verse 2. So that gives you an idea of how maybe the root word for her name or what her name is based on was used in common speech during that particular time. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was famine in the land. And the interesting thing about this is the word famine, nor a description of famine as we understand it, occurs in the book of Judges. Josephus, for some reason, thinks that this lay in the days of Eli. Okay. Kyle Delitzsch suggests it occurs during the Midianite oppression in Judges 6. And I would personally go with that one over the Eli simply because what did the Midians do to Israel's crops when they grew? They burned them. They destroyed them. And Gideon was beating out his wheat in a wine press so that they wouldn't find it and destroy it. And so could that be the time? It could be. We just don't know for sure when that was. But at some point in this history, there was famine. And what did famine symbolize in Israel's relationship to God? Disobedience. You think about, we've been reading through our Old Testament. If you're doing our Bible reading program that we set aside from the church this week. And one thing hit me, and this kind of hit me after we finished Judges. What does Samson have to kill? A lion. When the land was being conquered, it was conquered in stages so that the wild animals wouldn't get too plentiful. And then if wild animals were in presence, what did God allow to happen? What was that a sign of? That their evil God had allowed them back. So can you make a connection between the lion Samson had to kill and the evil Israel was doing? Well, I think so, in that context. So, again, interesting stuff here. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. And while it doesn't specifically say that, there was a famine in the land, they went to dwell in Moab. That makes sense that must have been food in Moab. Must have been something for them in Moab for them to go and to do that. And here's a map of the area enlarged. There's Bethlehem in the upper left and Moab in the right. You can see that map calls it the Salt Sea. We call it the Dead Sea. And its footprint doesn't look like that anymore. They've used so much water to irrigate crops and everything that the Dead Sea itself is shrinking, and so it's much smaller than that. But that's probably about the shoreline that it would have been during the days that we're talking about here. And so whether they went around the north side and over to Moab or went around the south side, we don't know. We don't know anything about how they got there, but they went to Moab ostensibly because they could eat there. They could enjoy their food there. Interesting when you look at the names that are given and the meaning that it's assigned to those names. Elimelech was named as God is King, according to the Younger's Bible Dictionary, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, and the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible. So, when he was born, his parents named him this. What does that tell you about their mindset? They were at least thinking about it. Remember, this is during the days of the judges at some point. And so things are not good in Israel. And so Elimelech is named God as King. And so is that significant? I don't know. I have told you this before. My name has significant meaning. Kevin. Means bald-headed. And it fits. And maybe Elimelech's name fit in his relationship with God and the relationship of how he did his family. Sometimes you name a child and you just name them because you like the name and there's no significant meaning to them. A lot of commentators seem to find meaning in the names of the people. And in this case, maybe they've got something where Naomi, pleasantness, delight. And certainly she demonstrates that in her life, and those are the references of who calls her that. Mahlon, sickly, invalid. What happens to Mahlon and Chilion? They both die young. So could that be an indicator of maybe they weren't the best of health to begin with? Could be. Chilion, pining, wasting away, failing. And so maybe these give us an indication as to what happened with them once they got into the land of Moab there. So they're from Bethlehem, they go to the thing there. I think I put those slides in there twice. Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Ephrathite, Ephrath, is the ancient name of Bethlehem. That's what it was called before it was called Bethlehem. And so that's where that particular name comes from. In Genesis 35, verses 16 and 19, then they journeyed from Bethel, and when they were but a little distance to go to Ephrath, Rachel travailed in childbirth. She had a hard labor. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And so it gives us an idea of where we're talking about. Not only is it significant because that's where Jesus was born, it's the hometown of David, but because of all the things that happened there in that particular place that we call Bethlehem today. Genesis 48 verse 7, but as for me, when I come from Padan on the way, when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And so, again, just giving us an idea, geographical sense of where they are. Moab, son of Lot by his elder daughter. You remember that story, don't you? Got out of Sodom and Gomorrah, out in the cave somewhere. Mom would look back, turn to a pillar of salt. And what did the two girls decide was the problem? We don't have any offspring. We don't have any heirs. And so they got Dad drunk, and you know the rest of that story of what happened with them. So Moab was the result of that. So again, we're talking about this happened way back in the days of Abraham. And now we fast forwarded hundreds of years, and Moab is still part of that narrative, part of that picture. And Ruth is a part of that as well. And so, so many things in the Bible, they're all connected together, even though one may have happened hundreds of years earlier, and the next one 100 years later. It's all connected if you start looking for those direct connections to them. Moab or the Moabites are mentioned 179 times in the Old Testament. That's out of the New King James Version. Their chief deity was Chemosh. He's mentioned 8 times in the Old Testament. Numbers 21 and verse 29. Woe to you, Moab! You have perished, O people of Chemosh. 1 Kings 11:7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem. And so again, there's the idolatrous influence of Moab on Israel. It's still going on even after the Judges storyline is over. And we're dealing with that in the days of Solomon, who builds a temple to this guy. And so thinking about all of that, to me, looking back then from here to the story of Ruth makes that story so much sweeter, because she gave up her foreign gods, she gave up her foreign life, and devoted herself wholly to Jehovah God. And that, to me, makes that story even more special to keep in mind, because this is what she was raised with. This is what she grew up with. Moab tried to hire Balaam to curse Israel as they conquered the land of Canaan, Numbers chapter 22. And again, just a brief history of Moab. Numbers 25, verses 1 through 3. Now Israel remained in the acacia grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. So again, issues between Moab and Israel all along. And what makes the story of Ruth so wonderful is that it steps out of that mold of the evil that Moab was doing and that Israel was doing with them, and it shows us a picture of somebody who was doing it right, who was being faithful and doing what God wanted them to do. Deuteronomy 2 and verse 9, the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, nor contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. And so that's one of the reasons Moab was still there, because God had not given that land to Israel because because of the connection back to Lot and Abraham and all of that. And so that's why Moab is still in the world, making a difference, if you will, in the world. Judges 3 and verse 12, we read this one in our study. Children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And so the children of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, 18 years. And so again, we're just kind of running through the history of Moab's relationship with Israel. Israel cries out to God. God appoints Ehud as judge or deliverer, Judges 3 and verse 15. And 10,000 men of Moab were killed, and Israel has rest for 80 years after this particular narrative. Judges 10 and verse 6. Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the people of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. And they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So again, we went through all this in the book of Judges over and over and over again. They seemed to like the new flavor of whatever God was there, and they embraced it and followed it. Israel cries out to God again, Judges 10 and verse 10. Jephthah judges Israel, delivers them in Judges chapter 11. Here's an interesting thought. Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 4. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. And so again, there is that restriction all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 23. Nehemiah 13. On that day when they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So it was when they had heard the law that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. Do you see a problem with the book of Ruth based on what we just read? All right, you're seeing that. So the question is naturally raised, well, how could Ruth be a part of then the lineage of David if that prohibition was in place? Here's one explanation. Different kinds of outsiders lived in and around the Israelites. With 2 1/2 tribes of Israel inhabiting the east side of the Jordan, where the Moabites and Ammonites lived, and where the Israelites were currently camping, when Moses gave the Moabite-Ammonite restriction of Deuteronomy 23, he was referring to the non-converted, uncircumcised alien or foreign Moabite Ammon who was never to be allowed in the general Israelite community. Ruth may have been a Moabite ethically, but religiously she was a dedicated follower of the Lord, who participated and abided by Mosaic law. Thus, she and her faithful descendants, including David, were rightly accepted in Israel. Another reason Deuteronomy 23:3 would not have applied to Ruth and her offspring is simply because a non-Israelite mother in Israel, especially one who was a proselyte, did not determine the nationality of her offspring. Joseph's Egyptian wife did not make their sons Ephraim and Manasseh Egyptians. Moses' marriage to Zipporah, the Midianite, did not disqualify her sons Gershom and Eleazar from being Israelites, nor did it make them Midianites. Salmon's marriage to Rahab did not mean their son Boaz was recognized as a Gentile of Jericho. And the Moabites, Bitus Ruth, wife of Boaz, did not make their son Obed, their grandson Jesse, their great-grandson David, or their descendants Joseph and Mary, the earthly parents of Jesus, anything other than the legitimate descendants of Abraham. And so again, that's one particular, this is Eric Lyons, by the way. According to the standard reckoning of Israelite heritage, in the eyes of all Israel, David was an Israelite of the tribe of Judah, and he was no more Moabite than he was Jerichoan. And again, that's Eric Lyons, who's from Apologetic Press, wrote that, and the issue with Ruth, David, and the Moabite mandate. Thoughts, comments? Jeanette?
Has anyone calculated or how many generations to Ruth?
Would have been from Deuteronomy 23? That's the good question. And there are those who have tried. There's just no way to do that. Yeah. So 10 generations, okay? How long is a generation? A generation is what now? About 40 years? Okay, so 10 generations, that's 400 years. How long was the book of Judges? A little over 400 years, plus the time before that. So you could make the argument that prohibition had passed by the time frame. And so that, again, just bring this up because I think it's an interesting wrinkle on this, that nowhere in the book of Ruth is anything ever said about that. And since she is included in the lineage of David and of Jesus, God must have approved of this, or something would have been said about it. Bob?
The lifespan back then, and the fact that families were raised much younger, I think that generational figure would be more to 20 to 25 years.
Okay, could possibly be, and that's the trouble. We can't. What did they consider a generation? And they may have known that, and it's just not recorded for us. But again, my take on it is, if God didn't say anything about it, then there wasn't an issue to be talked about. Glenn?
There in verse 2, where it says they were Ephraimites, that's referring to where the country they were from. They were in the tribe of Judah, weren't they?
Yes, Ephrathites, because that was the name of Bethlehem before it became Bethlehem. So yeah, they weren't from the tribe of Ephraim; they were from the tribe of Judah, and from Ephrath or Bethlehem. Okay, all right. Anything else? I know a lot of this is dry history. We'll get it out of the way today, and then we'll deal with the better part of the story as we move on. This is from one of the missionaries of Jewish people in their writing, and not inspired, but this is their take on this. According to Jewish law and tradition, curses follow the father, not the mother. In Jewish commentaries, rabbis generally interpret the command of Deuteronomy 23:3 to apply to a male Moabite, but not to a Moabitess. Ammon and Moabite converts are prohibited from entering into the congregation and marrying a woman who is born Jewish, and their prohibition is eternal for all generations. However, their female counterparts, even the convert herself, are permitted immediately. And so again, that's how one Jewish rabbi explains that, and I don't know who he is. I just found him doing research on this, and we'll leave it at that. Surely the answer lies in two things, closely related. Firstly, the character and commitment of Ruth, and secondly, the character of the God of Israel, whom she came to love and serve. Naomi's two sons took them wives of the women of Moab. Not a promising place when we remember the daughters of Moab from Numbers 25 and verse 1. But the circumstances were different. And they dwelled there about 10 years, and it seems evident that through that period, Naomi became a teacher of the things of Israel and its God to Ruth in particular, who came to dearly love her mother-in-law and to believe implicitly in Yahweh, the God of Israel. Mahlon and Chilion died, and Naomi determined to return. She had heard that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Consider Ruth's statement of faith, which goes far beyond a deep personal love from Naomi. Though that was evident, thy people shall be my people, and thy God shall be my God. Orpah, Naomi had said, had gone back unto her people and to her gods, returned after their sister-in-law. Ruth rejects that course emphatically, says she has no people but the people of Israel, no God but the God of Israel. Moreover, Ruth now commits to burial in Israel's soil, just as Joseph gave commands concerning his bones, after the pattern of Jacob his father. Ruth had changed her allegiance and was now one with her new people, dwelling under the care of Yahweh, God of Israel, and now her God too. And again, that's from Rob Thiel, or Ruth the Moabitess, in a publication called The Lampstand back in 2016. So maybe that gives us a better idea of this prohibition and how it plays out and how it works in the setting, because there are those people you will read who say, well, oops, you got a mistake here in your Bible, and you better deal with that. Of course, they don't want us to deal with it because they don't care. That's why they're pointing out the mistakes in the Bible. But anyway, an issue, if you ever run across that. The book of 1 Samuel indicates a close relationship between David and Moab when during the period of his outlawry, and again, that's that particular author's word, the future king entrusted his father and mother to the care of the king of Moab. And so again, there's ties back and forth just all over the place between Israel and Moab. And again, long-standing, Moab is a descendant of Lot, who is tied to Abraham. And so there's a kinship there to a certain extent that God seems to keep acknowledging, even though they've gone off into the worship of the Baals and Chemosh and all those other gods as well. A result of his grandmother Ruth, perhaps. Maybe that his grandmother told him those stories, and he learned from her, and that's why he entrusted their care to the king of Moab at the time, when he was being pursued by those who would destroy him. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. What was, as best you can tell, the status of Naomi when her husband died? Okay, yeah, she says bitter. She'll use that word to describe herself, bitter. Again, she did not inherit her husband's property or anything. That's not how it worked in those days. The sons inherited it. And so she was left with her two sons, and at that point, I guess things were okay. And they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Ruth 4 and verse 10 says, Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, I've acquired as my wife. That was Boaz talking about that later. And that's the last slide I had prepared for this morning. What we're going to see, though, next is who's going to die. Mahlon and Chilion. And so she's left without any male to inherit any of that process. And that's what leads us to the whole story with Boaz, the near kinsman and the redeemer, who is going to make it possible for her lineage to carry on through him, even though her husband and her sons are both dead. And that's an interesting part of that story that we'll talk about as well. All right, any other thoughts, comments, questions? We'll quit right there if you don't have anything else and pick up there. Go ahead, Amy.
There must have been something about Naomi and her family that really made Ruth want to follow Naomi.
Absolutely. It says they dwelled there 10 years. And so she got an intimate look at the life these people lived. And something about that she was willing to give up her entire nation and history to go with them. And so that tells us something about the home life that was there. And obviously the love and the compassion. And maybe she saw Naomi deal with the grief she had to deal with by losing her sons and losing her husband. And maybe that impressed her in how she could deal with that. Again, text doesn't tell us that, but that would seem to me, it would be easy for Naomi to lose it, so to speak, in that when she lost everybody. But somehow she remained faithful, and that faithfulness pulled Ruth in, and Ruth went back with her and made that famous statement, "Your God's my God now." All right? Anything else? All right, appreciate it. Thank you.